Welcome back, AP. All right, welcome to your first of two flips going into Easter break, right? So I know that I told y'all I'd try to keep these at about no more than 25 minutes. So I'm going to go ahead and start a timer so I can actually be able to have an audio signal if I do go over that time. But big things we're moving into, and we are going to be moving swiftly through this content because a lot of it is pretty straightforward and a lot of it is very, very intense. And a lot of it kind of exposes the inadequacies, atrocities, genocidal tendencies, and also the murderousness that was imperialism by Europeans in the late 1800s. Now, some people might disagree with this. A lot of historians kind of chalk this up to just this is something that just kind of happened. I believe that imperialism is on par with many genocidal atrocities that we actually study in the modern era, including on the guise of the Holocaust, the Rwandan genocide, and many other things that actually could be lumped into these things together. So it's important to understand where we left off in class. We're talking about what are our biggest motivations for imperialism? What is imperialism? What's imperialism versus colonialism, right? So the motivations, though, outside of money, of course, were the use of post-industrial technology. Why was there no imperialism before 1850, right? Well, one of the biggest reasons that imperialism kind of switched from colonialism into this new form of imperialism, which we'll continue to discuss here as this entire prezi keeps going, and why that big differentiation around 1850 is so important. A lot of it has to do with new weaponry, right? So weaponry, of course, is going to be the thing that allows Europeans to imperialize so swiftly and so intensely, right? So in the early 1800s, we started moving away from musket balls and moving to these things known as mini balls and rifling, right? Mini balls or mini balls, which is actually, this doesn't mean mini like small, it means mini as in after the last name of the guy who invented it. French gunmaker actually created the very first cartridge bullet-looking things for your musket, and also the introduction of rifling made these new forms of muskets much more accurate, right? And the very first time they were demonstrated in their effectiveness was going to be during the Crimean War when the Russians were still using musket balls and unrifled guns, whereas the British, the French, and the coalition forces are going to be using rifled mini balls, right? Now, imagine taking these things and turning them against people who are underdeveloped, right? So, of course, this is going to be used very swiftly, and it's going to be very effective in taking out large native populations, right? Breech loading guns also comes in the 1870s. That's a lot like the Dreisen needle gun we talked about in the Austro-Prussian War. That is where the bolt actually comes back. You load the bullet into the back of the muzzle rather than in the front. That, although, is not going to pop up until around 1870, all right? So, and then by 1899, the Maxim gun becomes the thing that allows imperialists to take over very, very swiftly. The Maxim gun, invented by Hiram Maxim, is going to actually fire 200 rounds per minute, right? So you also have another big reason why imperialism after 1850 is going to boom so aggressively. And a big thing about it is new transportation systems, right? You have steam-powered trains, and now you also have steam-powered boats, right? That can actually travel much further, much faster. And some of these steam-powered boats would even later be augmented so they could float up rivers, right? Going through shallow waters, making it very easy for them to navigate large rivers like the Yangtze, the Ganges, and also like the Congo, right? Giving them the ability for Europeans to now go into very dense areas, dense forested areas, and actually be able to travel swiftly upriver without the use of large pack animals and things like that, right? So going forward, though, what is the most important one? This is probably the most important development going into the 1850s that gave the Europeans the ability to imperialize so quickly, and a lot of it has to do with medicine, right? Medicine, or of course, medicinal items, mainly in the form of quinine, right? So ever since the early 1830s, with scientists like Robert Koch, and then also French scientist Louis Pasteur, who are going to create germ theory, they're also going to begin to adventure their ideas into vaccinations, viral theory, things like that, right? Leading to the ideas of vaccinations and creating medicines to fight off these microbiological animals, moving away again from this whole idea of miasmatic theory, right? The biggest one, though, that comes onto the scene is this stuff called quinine, right? Quinine medicine is derived from the bark of a South American tree that the natives in South America had been using for thousands of years, right? And the natives actually tried their best to keep it hidden from the European powers for a very long time, but unfortunately they are going to learn how to synthesize it, and quinine medicine could be used to fight off the effects of malaria, right? So now you have a medicine that prevents people from getting malaria or from feeling the symptoms of malaria, and so now we are looking at an idea that we have better guns, better transportation, and we will stay healthier, so now Europeans can imperialize any area on the globe. This is going to lead to this concept of new imperialism, right? New imperialism is the culmination of all the things we've talked about, of colonialism dying out and becoming economically unprofitable, new weaponry, new transportation, quinine medicine, economic gain, military glory, national intentions, right? That leads to what a lot of historians refer to as new imperialism, trying to differentiate it from the old imperialism, which I call colonialism. So that you need to understand. New imperialism is the imperialism that occurred post-1850, okay? So big thing coming down the pipe now, though, okay? So now you have the ability to have this quinine medicine, right? Apparently the British would oftentimes take their quinine in their gin and tonics, right? They would actually drink it. Very simple medicine that prevented them from getting malaria. Now that you have this Maxim gun, now that you have breech loading rifles, now that you have all these things, where are you going to go imperialize? Who gets imperialized first? Well, the people that are going to get imperialized is the underdeveloped remaining world, right? So we now in the modern era would call this the third world, right? Now the third world classification system did not pop up until post-World War II, so please do not think that the word third world came from the 1850s, because it did not, okay? It actually came after World War II to differentiate between capitalist countries, i.e. first world, and communist countries, i.e. second world, and the third world was the remaining territories that those two parties were fighting over, right? So, but to give you a sense, modern era, we would refer to these underdeveloped remaining world or areas as the third world, right? This is the unindustrialized world, the tribal world, the subsistence world, right? So examples include India, the EIC, and the Crown, right? So the big thing to understand, a big example of who's getting imperialized was India, right? The East India Company being the very first ones to go there, and then of course the British Crown ending up taking over it in 1857, which we're going to talk about very heavily in this flip, but we're going to talk about it towards the end, right? Now, the biggest area that fell subject to hardcore new imperialist tactics during the 1800s is going to be Asia. Southeast Asia specifically, areas including China, Vietnam, Japan, other areas as such, right? And what this process was referred to as is the opening of Asia, right? The opening of Asia, because Asia in the 1800s was closed off to just about any European influence or European trade organizations, right? Now, when I say Asia, I don't mean India, even though India is in Asia. I mean Southeast Asia, particularly when we're referring to right now, is China, right? And to give you context of why the British are going to seek to try and open up Asia so aggressively and why they target China first, you have to understand that in the 1790s, the British are broke as a joke, right? They have no money. The Industrial Revolution is just beginning to bubble up, right? They're heavily in debt. They are also, luckily for them, being able to stay uninvolved in the French Revolutionary crisis that's going on in the continent. Now, couple the ideas of industrial movement with economic gain. So the British are slowly beginning to dig themselves out of this massive amount of debt due to the industrial and industrious revolutionary movements, post-agricultural revolutionary movement of the 1660s. Why could I spit that out so quickly? Now, anyway, it's like I rehearsed this. Now, the big thing, though, is that the 1790s Britain is very, very broke, right? Whereas China is very, very not. All right, so China was actually economically extremely prosperous, right? They were under the control of this thing known as the Qing dynasty, which had been ruling over China. One family had been ruling over the China known as the Celestial Kingdom for over 200 years, right? They practiced something called economic isolationism, right? So they refused to buy British goods, right? The British looked upon China as being like, oh, They have things we want. We have industrialized goods. We have cheap cotton textiles. We have wool textiles. We have all these things. Maybe the Chinese will want to buy these things from us, and then we can use their good economy to dig us out of our bad economy. Well, the problem is that the Chinese don't want your garbage trinkets, Great Britain. They don't want cheap cotton textiles. They have silk. They don't want your manufactured porcelain. They have Chinese porcelain. And they also don't want anything else you're selling because they have a lot of economic goods that make a bunch of money. One of the biggest ones including there is tea, right? And the only way that British people were allowed to trade anyway was in one city known as Canton, right? So Canton is on the banks of a very, very large waterway in China and is right near the island of Hong Kong, right? So the British look upon China and they're like, man, not only are they making more money than we are, they're refusing to buy any of our products, and also we are still losing money because they have something we desperately want, tea, right? By this point in history, the 1800s, the British are heavily addicted to tea. 10% of the average annual household income was being directed towards the purchase of tea, right? So that is insanely high. Tea was very expensive coming from China. So the biggest thing the Brits kept going up to the Chinese was saying, well, allow us to go further into China. Allow us to try and sell these goods there. And the Chinese are like, no, because we don't want your stuff here corrupting our people, right? And they had every right to do that. The Chinese were very smart in doing this, right? So the British decided to try and find one good that maybe the Chinese would want in exchange for their tea so they could actually sell it back in Britain at a cheaper cost. And so what they do is they begin to trade opium for tea. Now, I don't know if you know this, but opium is the same stuff that makes heroin, all right? It makes oxycodone. It makes opium-based or opioid-based painkillers in the United States. This stuff is heavily illegal here, and it was extremely illegal in closed, economically isolated Qing dynasty China, right? They knew that if opium was allowed to circulate through its streets, that economic productivity would massively go down, and they were trying to protect their people because the Chinese had outlawed opium for quite some time, right? The British started growing opium, though, legally in India, right? They start growing it in India, processing it into opium, and the opium would then be smoked by a lot of people, which became a very, very direct way to get a sensation of being lucid, it's a depressant, and getting them very, very addicted to this drug, right? So the idea that the British are going to start trading illegally drugs to Chinese merchants in exchange for their tea, that is going to make this tea borderline cost-free because they're growing this opium for so cheap in India, right? And they're going to go back to England and sell it for a massive profit. Now, the problem is that this is stupid illegal in China. Really, Great Britain, you decided to give drugs to a society because they didn't want to buy your garbage, all right? So now going forward, though, you really shouldn't do this because it's illegal in China, but the Brits are going to do it anyway, right? So they're going to start trading this opium to Chinese merchants illegally. The opium is going to begin to get smuggled in through the ports of Canton. They're going to start bribing Cantonese officials, and they're going to start trying to infiltrate the Chinese society using drug trade, right? Now, the Chinese tried to stop this. The Dowager Emperor actually deliberately tried to stop this by appointing a guy that he knew named Liu Zhuzong, all right? So now, this Chinese diplomat and general tried to stop the sale of opium by dumping it into the sea, seizing it at ports, destroying it on beaches, and a lot of different things like that. He also deliberately tried to send a letter to Queen Victoria telling him that your EIC, your East India Company, is selling drugs to our people deliberately, aggressively. So do us a favor and please stop, right? That letter never made it to Queen Victoria, right? And in the process of him writing that letter, Chinese officials then seized 21,000 chests of opium at the ports of Canton, right? 21,000 chests. They then took those chests of opium, burned them, and sank them to the bottom of the Chinese Bay, right? So, or not the Chinese Bay, but the ports at Canton, right? So, the Brits, the EIC particularly, because they're deliberately keeping this letter away from Queen Victoria, are then going to demand compensation for their illegal drugs. I don't know if I can hammer this home so like very much harder. The British sold things illegally to a population of people to get them addicted to drugs so they could have tea for cheaper. And then when these people and their local government decide to seize these drugs and destroy them to prevent the destruction of lives and the destruction of their economy and the destruction of families within their country, they are then going to destroy them, and the Brits demand money for their lost drugs. This would be like a drug cartel demanding the American government compensation for destroyed drugs. This is bananas, right? And the fact that they demanded compensation and the Chinese refused, this is going to lead to the very first Opium War. And the very first Opium War broke out in 1839. The British, though, are going to use the products of their Industrial Revolution to totally overwhelm the Chinese forces. Even though they were outnumbered 50,000 Chinese soldiers to 6,000 British soldiers. And why were they able to do this? A lot of it has to do with the fact that the British Army was heavily trained. Many of them were veterans of other foreign wars, including Crimean War, 7 Years' War, French and Indian War, other uprisings that they had suppressed in places like India, right? They were heavily trained, had heavy units, and they also had better technology. Most of the Chinese soldiers were still using spears, swords, and bows and arrows, right? So, whereas the British had fully functioning, albeit they were like not the best guns on the planet, they're still muskets, and it still takes them a long while to load them, but they also had cannons, right? Mobile artillery, and they also had steam-powered vessels. The biggest one and the most popular one was known as the HMS Nemesis, right? Her Majesty's Service Nemesis, or Her Majesty's Ship, the Nemesis. This thing was actually powered completely by steam and had an iron hull. And as you can see in this thing, this right here is a Chinese ship with a wooden hull that it is just deliberately destroyed, right? So the British are going to heavily overwhelm the Chinese, and they're going to win this first Opium War, and then they're going to demand that the Chinese pay them money for that original shipment, and they're going to be forced to open up trade to the British, right? So China was now, since it was closed early on, is going to be forcefully opened to British trade, right? And this is going to include the legalization of opium. This is bananas. This is absolutely insane. This is a European country imposing its will and its drug trade on another group of people that don't want it, right? So, and the Chinese were forced to sign this very first of things known as unequal treaties because it heavily advantaged the British and heavily disadvantaged the Chinese, right? The Chinese then and the Qing Chinese are going to have to pay a huge amount, millions of dollars in indemnities to the British government, and British traders were not going to be subject to Chinese laws. So basically, you just created a system where the British are going to be legally allowed to sell drugs inside of a country, and they're also going to be allowed to sell whatever they want inside of this, like these ports that were previously closed to them. And then also, not to mention the fact that if they were to do something wrong, Chinese law cannot punish them, right? This is going to start a period of time known as the Century of Humiliation for the Chinese, right? Because it's going to be the very first of a series of unequal treaties. Because, of course, now that the rest of Europe has seen the British heavily favor themselves and become economically advantaged inside of, like, the Qing Chinese Empire, then here comes America and France. Ooh. Yeah, I hate to break it to y'all, but we were also heavily involved in this Century of Humiliation against Asiatic empires, right? The Americans and French are going to then impress their own versions of unequal treaties on the Qing, threatening military action, right? The Qing were also fighting internal rebellions, so they did not have the ability to fight off the Americans and the French as well at the exact same time. One of the biggest rebellions that was going on inside of their borders was known as the Taiping Rebellion, where a very, very large group of converted Chinese Christians were trying to rebel against the Dowager Emperor and trying to destroy their entire Qing dynasty from the inside. The Taiping Rebellion would lead to the death of some estimates as 20 million Chinese people, right? At the hands of other Chinese people because they're trying to suppress a revolt and then also trying to fight off foreign invaders, right? So the refusal to trade with the Brits later on. So these treaties were signed. Here come the Americans, here come the French, right? They're now involved, piggybacking off of the British opening of China, right? The Canton system was going to be thrown out the window, right? Now that they're going to be allowed to trade at several different ports, okay? Also, other really, really important thing, the island of Hong Kong was going to be forced to be ceded to the British as well, right? An interesting fact, if you did not know this already, Hong Kong remained a British what's the word I'm looking for? A British holding or a British owned thing all the way up until the 1990s, right? So the refusal, though, to continue to trade with the British because other cities in China are going to be like, no, we don't want to trade with you. We still want to keep this closed. We don't want your crap, right? So, and they're going to refuse to do this also because of this arsenic bread situation. So there was a very large Chinese bakery that actually baked a huge amount of bread that the British would buy and then ship to Europe, right? And in the process of shipping this bread to Europe, there was a bunch of families in Europe, especially in Great Britain, that actually succumbed to arsenic poisoning. And they found out later on that apparently the arsenic may or may not have been deliberately put into the bread by the bakers in China trying to attack the people of Great Britain in their actual homes, right? Now, I kind of find this to be like, hey, you got us, we're going to get you back because, you sold drugs to our people, no big deal. And so this is going to lead to the outbreak of the Second Opium War, right? And then the Second Opium War is going to last from 1856 to 1860, and a coalition of forces are going to unite together to try and destroy the Qing forces in the Second Opium War, right? And coalition of forces, I mean not just the British this time, but the French, the Americans, the Russians, even also the Germans as well, right? So, well, not the Germans completely because they weren't actually they weren't fully formed yet, but some Prussian forces were there. So, and yes, I'm not joking, Napoleon III was directly involved in this and directly called for the invasion of China a second time in the Second Opium War, just because, yet again, they did not want to allow drugs to be sold in their country, right? So the Qing power is going to be destroyed after this, and the Europeans are going to be destroying this idea of the celestial kingdom, right? That once glorious Chinese culture that existed before the 1830s, before the First Opium War, the one that actually profited heavily off of their own internal economics, the ones that made goods that the rest of the world wanted, the place that was doing so well and doing so prosperous, have pretty much been completely destroyed, first by the British and then by the rest of the world, the developed world, right? And so after this, and after the suppression of a revolt that we will talk about in the next flip, known as the Boxer Rebellion, there is going to be the establishment of this thing known as spheres of influence, where basically the rest of the developed world would create areas that their country would control and trade inside of, right? So here, for example, was the Russian sphere of influence that would later be taken by the Japanese. As we know, the fighting over this led to the Russo-Japanese War, right? Japanese would actually take over Korea. We'll talk about why the Japanese are actually involved in this entire thing in a minute. The British are going to take over this entire system on the Yangtze River, and then they're also going to take over Canton and Hong Kong, and then the Japanese are going to take over Taiwan. The French are then going to come in as well and take over this entire area known as now modern-day Vietnam and can turn it into what's known as French Indochina, right? So this entire thing is absolutely wild. And the sad part is, it's not the first nor the last time it was going to happen, right? Another massive example of opening an Asian economy was that of Japan, right? And we're going to jump back in time to the 1850s, okay? So another example of this early economic isolationism was Japan. Japan was completely economically isolated and was illegal for foreigners to trade inside of their country, right? Until the arrival of a U.S. diplomat, right? U.S. Admiral Matthew Perry. No, not Matthew Perry from Friends, but Matthew Perry and U.S. Admiral showed up and threatened the Japanese and saying, you have 1 year to open this country to American traders, or else I am going to bring our gunboat and our giant American steam-powered armada, bring it back in 1860, and we're going to try to use it to destroy you, right? So this is going to lead to a massive set of rebellions inside of Japan over the argument of not wanting to allow Western traders in because they had seen what had happened in China, right? So this is going to lead to this thing known as the Meiji Restoration. The Meiji Restoration is going to see the appointment of a very young emperor, oftentimes called the Boy Emperor, right? And he is going to go then on a tirade of modernizing Japan. And from 1868 to 1931, following the gunboat diplomacy issued by Matthew Perry, you're going to see a massive amount of industrialization because Japan was forced with a choice. Do we get taken over like the Qing Chinese did, or do we actually modernize and become an imperial colony of our own? And they chose the modernization idea. They contracted through American, German, English, Russian, and other different figureheads of Europe took their ideas and their modernization ideas and modernized themselves much like a Western European country. And this, of course, is going to come to a figurehead when they try to take over Chinese Manchuria and to get involved in this Opium War crisis. And they take that from the Russians during the Russo-Japanese War, right? So that is imperialism and the modernization in Japan. And this is where we're going to stop. And we're going to pick up the next flip right after this. Y'all have a great Easter break. I'll see y'all in a minute.